Welcome back to Deep Lynx, where we dive into stories that go beyond the surface. Today, we're embarking on an imaginative journey through an alternate version of a beloved war game, Call of Duty: World at War, but with a twist. We're going to explore the game from the perspective of the Axis powers, Germany and Japan. What if, instead of playing as the American Marines or Soviet Red Army, we were the ones fighting to hold back the waves of Allied troops, facing overwhelming odds, the collapse of our home fronts, and the moral weight of a war we were losing? What if we saw the horrors of World War II from the other side of history? This is going to be an immersive reimagining of that classic story. Grab your headphones, get comfortable, and let's dive deep into this thought experiment. Setting the scene, war through different eyes. Before we delve into the specifics, let's set the stage. Call of Duty: World at War originally puts you in the boots of Allied soldiers during the final stages of World War II. The game explores two major theaters: the Pacific, where U.S. Marines battled the Imperial Japanese forces, and Europe, where Soviet soldiers grind their way toward Berlin. The game is gritty, brutal, and relentlessly intense, depicting the horrors of war with a level of detail that was groundbreaking at the time. But now, we're flipping the narrative. Imagine you're not the triumphant Allied forces, but a soldier fighting for survival in a war you're slowly realizing you've already lost. This is a war that is tearing your country apart, that has led to unspeakable atrocities, and that has forced you to question your own morality. This is World at War from the other side. The German campaign, Stalingrad to Berlin. Let's begin with the German perspective, starting on the Eastern Front, the most brutal and unforgiving theater of the entire war. Our protagonist here is Hans Richter, a young German soldier. Hans is not a fanatical Nazi. He's not fighting for ideology or hatred. He's fighting because he has no choice. He's a conscript, a kid who barely understands the political machinery that has thrown him into the chaos of the Eastern Front. Episode 1: The Frozen Hell of Stalingrad. Our story begins in late 1942, in the freezing, hellish winter of Stalingrad. Hans and his comrades are entrenched on the outskirts of the city, fighting to hold on as the Soviet forces relentlessly attack. The Germans are losing ground, morale is crumbling, and the bitter Russian winter is proving to be as lethal as the enemy's bullets. Hans, like most of the soldiers around him, is exhausted. The cold gnaws at their bones, their supplies are dwindling, and the Soviets are relentless. But it's not just the enemy they're battling, it's the realization that the invincible German war machine is faltering. Hans overhears whispers among the older soldiers, rumors that Berlin isn't sending reinforcements, that they're on their own. Here, we have a scene that mirrors the original Soviet perspective in the game, where Reznov fights to push back the Germans. But now, it's Hans and his comrades who are being pushed back. The sense of dread is palpable. Each skirmish feels like a delay of the inevitable. The Soviets are encircling the city, and the trap is closing. The emotional weight of these moments is heavy. Hans isn't just fighting to stay alive, he's fighting the creeping realization that everything he's been told about German superiority might be a lie. The propaganda broadcasts blaring from the radio seem hollow now, nothing but desperate attempts to keep them fighting. Eventually, the Germans are surrounded. The Sixth Army, once a fearsome force, is now trapped in Stalingrad, with no hope of escape. As supplies run out and frostbite claims the weakest among them, Hans and a small group of survivors decide to attempt a breakout. This isn't about winning anymore, it's about surviving. Episode 2: The Long Retreat. Hans's journey doesn't end in Stalingrad. After barely escaping the Soviet encirclement, he and a few fellow soldiers retreat westward across the frozen steppe, harried by Soviet forces at every turn. They have no idea where their next meal will come from, no clue how they'll make it back to German lines. The bitter cold, hunger, and exhaustion are their constant companions. In this part of the campaign, we explore the desperation of retreat, the psychological toll of defeat. We'd also begin to see Hans's moral awakening. Along their retreat, they encounter other German units, some who are just as disillusioned as Hans, others who remain fanatical Nazis, hell-bent on fighting to the last man. These encounters force Hans to reckon with the ideology he's fighting for. At first, he brushes these thoughts aside. He's just a soldier, following orders, right? But as they march west, the atrocities committed by his own side become harder to ignore. The Soviet forces continue their relentless push, and the Germans are forced to abandon village after village. This is a fight they cannot win, but retreat isn't easy. The Soviets are out for revenge, and every German soldier they capture faces a brutal fate. This is a far cry from the glory and honor Hans was promised when he first donned the uniform. Eventually, after months of retreating, Hans makes it back to German-controlled territory. But there is no celebration, no relief. The German High Command is still demanding that soldiers fight on, despite the war's obvious trajectory. Hans is deployed to the next battle, exhausted and increasingly disillusioned. Episode 3, The Western Front, Otto Bauer's Desperation. While Hans is struggling on the Eastern Front, our second German protagonist, Otto Bauer, is a veteran officer fighting on the Western Front. Otto is part of a panzer division deployed to repel the Allied invasion of Normandy. This is a very different kind of war from what Hans is facing. While Hans is desperately fighting for survival, Otto is tasked with stopping the tide of Allied forces pouring into France. At first, Otto's campaign might feel more traditional for a Call of Duty game, lots of intense tank battles, ambushes, and counterattacks. But underneath the action is a growing sense of desperation. The Germans are being pushed back, and no matter how many times they try to regroup and counterattack, the Allies are always one step ahead. Otto is a seasoned officer, and at this stage of the war, he's seen everything. He's fought in Poland, France, and Russia, and he's watched countless men die under his command. Unlike Hans, who is young and still questioning, Otto knows exactly what the war is: brutal, unforgiving, and ultimately, pointless. In Normandy, Otto faces an overwhelming Allied advance. The Allies have air superiority, better equipment, and sheer numbers on their side. Otto's tanks are outdated, his men are running low on supplies, and every day brings news of another German defeat. And yet, the High Command demands that they fight on, telling them that reinforcements are coming, that Germany can still win this war. Otto knows better. He's been on the front lines long enough to understand that the war is lost. But he also knows that surrender is not an option, not yet. If he surrenders, he'll be executed for treason, and his men will likely face the same fate. So he fights on, not out of loyalty to the Nazi regime, but out of loyalty to his men, his comrades. He's trapped in a war he no longer believes in, with no way out. Episode 4, The Fall of Berlin. As the war grinds on, both Hans and Otto find themselves back in Germany for the final battle, the defense of Berlin. The once proud capital of the Third Reich is now a smoldering ruin, bombed to rubble by Allied and Soviet forces. The German army is a shadow of its former self. Old men and young boys are being conscripted into the defense of the city, fighting alongside what remains of the Wehrmacht. Hans is deployed to the eastern side of the city, tasked with holding back the Soviet onslaught. The streets are a nightmare of rubble, wreckage, and death. Every day brings more Soviet artillery fire, more bombings, and more casualties. Hans is no longer fighting for survival, he's fighting because there's no other choice. Otto, meanwhile, is stationed on the western side of the city. He and his tank crew are trying to delay the inevitable Allied invasion. But as the Americans and British close in, Otto is faced with a decision. Does he continue to fight for a regime that he knows is evil, or does he surrender to the Allies in the hope of saving his men? This is Otto's moment of reckoning. His entire campaign has been leading up to this, his internal struggle between duty and morality, between loyalty to his comrades and loyalty to a regime he no longer believes in. In the end, Otto chooses to surrender. He knows that the war is lost, and continuing to fight would only result in more unnecessary deaths. He leads his men to the nearest Allied forces, laying down his arms. For Otto, this is a moment of bittersweet relief. He's finally free of the war, but the price has been enormous. Hans, however, is not so fortunate. Trapped on the eastern side of Berlin, he is caught in the final Soviet assault on the city. The battle is a slaughter, with Soviet forces overwhelming the last remnants of German resistance. Hans fights to the bitter end, not because he believes in victory, but because he knows there is no escape. The Japanese campaign, fighting the rising sun. Now, let's shift our focus across the globe, to the Pacific theater of war. In the original World at War, players take on the role of American Marines fighting against the Imperial Japanese Army in brutal battles across the Pacific Islands. But what if, instead of playing as the Americans, we experienced the war through the eyes of a Japanese soldier? How would the story change? Our protagonist here is Takeshi Mori, a young Japanese soldier conscripted into the Imperial Army. Like Hans in Germany, Takeshi isn't a fanatical supporter of the regime, he's just a young man who's been swept up in a war he barely understands. Now let's take a wild turn and dive into the alternate reality of the world at War Zombies mode, but this time, the Germans and Japanese are the survivors, and the Allies are the undead. Picture it, instead of fending off hordes of Nazi zombies, Hans Richter and Takeshi Mori find themselves battling relentless waves of undead American Marines and Soviet soldiers. In this twisted world, the Allied forces, once feared for their overwhelming power in battle, have risen from the dead, transformed into mindless, relentless zombies. The battlefield is turned on its head as Hans and Takeshi, representing two crumbling Axis empires, must team up and defend makeshift bunkers, using whatever weapons and resources they can scrounge up. Each round brings more ferocious attacks from zombie Allied troops, their hollow eyes glowing with an eerie blue light, their rotting uniforms a grotesque reminder of the once unstoppable armies they belonged to. It's a fight not just for survival, but for redemption in a war-torn world turned upside down.